Breaking tonight, a transfer mass to region is underway in the Persian Gulf that may be the clearest warning sign yet of how great power competition is rewriting the rules of naval warfare in the 21st century. For decades, the United States Navy operated in the Strait of Hormuz and the waters of the Gulf with a confidence born of overwhelming superiority. American carrier strike groups, nuclear submarines, and advanced destroyers patrolled these waters as if they were an extension of American territory, enforcing freedom of navigation, projecting power ashore, and reminding every regional actor that challenging U.S. maritime dominance was not merely unwise but effectively impossible. That assumption is now being tested, and what is raising fears among strategists is not a single dramatic event, but a slow, methodical accumulation of capability in the hands of a force that was never supposed to possess it. Iranian naval and missile forces, long dismissed as asymmetrical nuisances rather than serious threats, may be entering a new phase of development, and behind much of that development, analysts see the fingerprints of a far larger power. China has not invaded Iran. China has not placed its flag on Iranian warships. But the military technologies, industrial partnerships, and doctrinal influences that have flowed from Beijing to Tehran over the past 2 decades may now be converging into something that could reshape the regional balance and force American naval planners to rethink everything they thought they knew about fighting in these waters. The story begins not with a missile launch or a naval exercise, but with a pattern that intelligence analysts and defense researchers have been tracking for years. Iranian military modernization has historically been constrained by sanctions, by industrial limitations, and by the difficulty of acquiring advanced components on the open market. Yet despite these constraints, Iranian forces have demonstrated capabilities that seem inconsistent with their indigenous industrial base. Anti-ship missiles with ranges and guidance systems that suggest foreign design influence, drones that bear structural similarities to Chinese platforms, radar and electronic warfare systems that appeared in Iranian inventory shortly after similar technologies were showcased in Chinese defense exhibitions. None of this is proof of direct state-to-state military construction, but it is evidence of a relationship that goes far beyond casual trade, and it raises concerns that what Iran now fields may be, in critical respects, a Chinese-influenced force operating under an Iranian flag. Consider the missile threat first, because it is the most immediate and the most dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow. At its narrowest point, it is less than 40 kilometers across. For a navy accustomed to operating in the open ocean, this is a nightmare geometry. There is no room to maneuver. There is no depth to absorb an attack. And there is no time to react if a salvo of anti-ship missiles is launched from concealed positions along the Iranian coast. The United States has spent billions of dollars developing layered missile defenses, from the Aegis combat system aboard its destroyers to the Patriot batteries protecting its regional bases. But missile defense is not invincible. It is a game of probabilities, and the probabilities shift dramatically when the attacker can saturate defenses with large numbers of relatively inexpensive weapons. Iran has invested heavily in exactly this approach, building arsenals of anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and swarm boats designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume, rather than individual sophistication. What has changed, and what may signal a dangerous new phase, is the quality of those weapons. Early Iranian anti-ship missiles were derivatives of older Soviet and Chinese designs, limited in range, accuracy, and survivability. More recent systems tell a different story. The Persian Gulf-class anti-ship ballistic missile, with its reported maneuvering re-entry vehicle and terminal guidance, represents a level of complexity that Iran's domestic defense industry has struggled to achieve in other domains. The Noor and Qatar cruise missiles, with their reported terrain-following capabilities and modern seekers, suggest access to design principles and components that are difficult to develop in isolation. Analysts do not claim that China handed Iran these weapons fully formed, but they do note that China's own anti-ship missile programs, from the DF-21D to the YJ-18 and YJ-12 families, have progressed along strikingly similar lines, and that Chinese industrial partnerships with Iranian defense entities have created channels through which technology, expertise, and even manufacturing know-how could flow in directions that are hard to monitor and harder to stop. The drone dimension is equally troubling and in some ways more visible. Iran has become one of the most prolific drone powers in the Middle East, fielding systems that range from small tactical reconnaissance platforms to large armed unmanned aerial vehicles capable of striking targets hundreds of kilometers away. The Shadow 136, which has gained notoriety for its use by Russian forces in Ukraine, is a loitering munition that is cheap to produce, difficult to detect, and devastating in large numbers. but the Shadow family is only the most public face of Iran's drone program. Beneath it lies a deeper architecture of design bureaus, manufacturing facilities, and supply chains that have benefited from foreign input at critical stages. Chinese drone technology, from airframe designs to flight control systems to data links, has appeared in Iranian systems with regularity that suggests more than coincidence. Chinese companies have sold dual-use components to Iranian entities under civilian cover. Chinese engineers have reportedly advised Iranian defense firms on manufacturing processes, and Chinese academic institutions have published research on drone swarm tactics that aligns closely with Iranian military doctrine. This matters for the U.S. Navy because drones change the cost equation of naval warfare in ways that favor the attacker. A modern American destroyer costs billions of dollars. A swarm of Iranian drones costs thousands of dollars per unit. If even a fraction of those drones penetrate a ship's defenses, the damage can be catastrophic. And if those drones are guided by Chinese-supplied satellite navigation, controlled through Chinese-designed communication links, and launched from Chinese-built coastal infrastructure, then the threat is not merely Iranian. It is a hybrid threat, an Iranian-Chinese fusion that exploits the gap between what is technically legal and what is strategically dangerous. The U.S. Navy has begun adapting, developing laser weapons, electronic warfare systems, and new tactical formations designed to counter drone swarms. But adaptation takes time, and time may be running out faster than procurement cycles allow. The submarine threat adds another layer of complexity. Iran operates a small fleet of submarines, mostly conventionally powered and of limited endurance by Western standards. But submarines do not need to be world-class to be dangerous in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf. A single diesel-electric submarine, operating on batteries in shallow water, can be nearly impossible to detect with traditional sonar. And if that submarine is armed with modern torpedoes or anti-ship missiles, it can pose a lethal threat to even the most advanced surface combatant. Iran's submarine program has received Chinese assistance at various points, from the transfer of midget submarine designs to training programs for Iranian naval personnel. The Kilo-class submarines that Iran acquired from Russia in the 1990s have been maintained and upgraded with components and expertise that analysts believe may include Chinese contributions. More recently, Iran has unveiled indigenous submarine designs that incorporate features from hull shapes to propulsion systems that suggest close study of Chinese and other foreign platforms. For American carrier strike groups, which depend on the ability to operate in relative safety from submarine threats, this is a serious concern. A carrier is the most powerful weapon system ever built, but it is also the most valuable target on the modern battlefield. The loss of a carrier, or even a serious damage incident, would be a strategic shock with political and military consequences far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. The U.S. Navy invests enormous resources in anti-submarine warfare, from dedicated hunter-killer submarines to maritime patrol aircraft to advanced sonar networks. But in the Gulf, the geography works against the defender. Shallow water, high ambient noise, and the proximity of Iranian ports to potential patrol areas create an environment where even a modest submarine force can pose a disproportionate threat. If Chinese technology has enhanced Iranian submarine quieting, sensor performance, or weapon effectiveness, that threat becomes more serious still. The electronic and cyber dimensions are harder to visualize, but no less consequential. Modern naval warfare is as much about information as it is about firepower. A ship that cannot see, cannot communicate, and cannot coordinate with its fleet is a ship that is already defeated. China is one of the world's leading powers in electronic warfare, cyber operations, and signals intelligence. Its capabilities in these domains are advanced, well-funded, and increasingly integrated into its own naval operations. The transfer of related technologies and techniques to Iran, whether through formal channels or through the gray market of defense industrial cooperation, could significantly enhance Iran's ability to disrupt American naval operations without firing a shot. Jamming GPS signals, spoofing radar returns, hacking into shipboard networks, and intercepting communications are all tactics that Iran has employed to varying degrees. If Chinese expertise amplifies these capabilities, the U.S. Navy may find itself fighting in an environment where its traditional information advantage is degraded or denied. This scenario is becoming harder to ignore because it aligns with broader Chinese strategy. China does not need to defeat the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf to achieve its objectives. It merely needs to raise the cost of American operations to a point where Washington questions whether the commitment is worth the risk. Every additional layer of threat that Iran can pose, whether from missiles, drones, submarines, or cyber operations, adds to that cost. Every American ship that must be diverted to missile defense, instead of power projection, every flight hour that must be spent on anti-submarine patrol instead of strike missions, every cyber vulnerability that must be patched instead of exploited, represents a strategic win for Beijing. And if a crisis ever arises in which China and the United States are in direct confrontation, whether over Taiwan or the South China Sea or some other flashpoint, the ability to tie down American naval forces in the Middle East becomes a force multiplier of immense value. The economic dimension reinforces this logic. China is the world's largest importer of oil, and a significant fraction of that oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. A disruption of Gulf energy flows would hurt China as much as anyone, but China has spent 2 decades diversifying its energy sources, building strategic petroleum reserves, and constructing pipeline networks that reduce its dependence on seaborne imports. The United States paradoxically has become less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than at any point in modern history, but its allies in Europe and Asia remain deeply vulnerable. A crisis in the Gulf that disrupts energy markets would therefore hurt American allies more than it would hurt China, and it would force Washington to choose between responding militarily and accepting economic damage to its partners. In this calculus, a more capable Iranian military serves Chinese interests, even if Beijing never explicitly endorses Iranian aggression. It creates options. It creates leverage. And it creates a strategic environment in which American freedom of action is constrained by threats that did not exist a generation ago. What makes this particularly dangerous is the possibility of miscalculation. Iran has a history of aggressive naval behavior, from harassing American ships to seizing commercial tankers to mining international waterways. These actions have historically been calibrated to stay below the threshold of open war, to provoke without triggering a massive American response. But calibration requires accurate assessment of risk, and accurate assessment requires understanding the balance of capabilities. If Iranian leaders believe that their military is more capable than it actually is, or if they believe that Chinese support provides a deterrent umbrella that it does not, they may take actions that escalate beyond their control. The downing of an American drone in 2019, the seizure of British tankers in the same year, and the periodic rocket attacks on bases hosting U.S. personnel all illustrate this pattern of testing boundaries. A more capable Iranian military, one that has been enhanced by Chinese technology and emboldened by Chinese diplomatic support, may test those boundaries more aggressively, with consequences that neither Tehran nor Beijing can fully predict. For the U.S. Navy, the operational challenge is compounded by the global nature of its commitments. The fleet that patrols the Persian Gulf is the same fleet that must deter China in the Pacific, respond to crises in the Mediterranean, and maintain a nuclear deterrent at sea. Every ship that is forward deployed to the Middle East is a ship that cannot be forward deployed to the South China Sea. Every dollar spent on missile defense for Gulf operations is a dollar that cannot be spent on hypersonic weapons or unmanned systems for the Pacific. The two-ocean deterrence crisis that some analysts fear is not a theoretical abstraction. It is a budgetary and operational reality that gets worse every year that the Chinese military modernizes and every year that Iranian capabilities advance. The Navy has asked for more ships, more missiles, more drones, and more personnel. Congress has struggled to fund all of these requests while also managing debt, domestic priorities, and competing defense demands. The result is a force that remains the most powerful in the world but is increasingly stretched across demands that exceed its sustainable capacity. If this scenario unfolds, the implications for American strategy in the Middle East could be profound. For half a century, the United States has guaranteed the security of Gulf energy flows as a core national interest. That guarantee has been backed by the implicit threat that any power that seriously threatened those flows would face overwhelming American military response. But what if the threat is no longer a single rogue state that can be bombed into submission? What if it is a layered, hybrid threat combining Iranian asymmetrical forces with Chinese technology, Chinese intelligence, and Chinese economic leverage? What if the cost of enforcing that guarantee becomes so high that Washington begins to question whether the guarantee is still worth making? These are not questions that American strategists want to ask, but they are questions that a more capable Iranian military, built in part with Chinese assistance, may force them to answer. The broader alliance implications are equally significant. The Gulf Arab states, from Saudi Arabia to the UAE to Qatar, have built their security architectures around American protection. They have purchased American weapons, hosted American bases, and coordinated their defense policies with Washington. But they have also watched the American political landscape with growing unease, seeing in the rhetoric of retrenchment and the reality of withdrawal from Afghanistan a superpower that may no longer be willing to bear the costs of Middle East security indefinitely. If American naval dominance in the Gulf is challenged by a Chinese-supported Iran, these states may begin to hedge their bets more aggressively, deepening ties with Beijing even as they maintain ties with Washington. The Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Gulf states, were partly a response to this uncertainty, an attempt to build regional security structures that did not depend entirely on American commitment. But those structures are new, untested, and potentially inadequate if the threat continues to grow. Israel faces its own version of this dilemma. The Israeli military is one of the most capable in the world, with advanced air power, intelligence capabilities, and missile defenses that have proven effective against Iranian threats. But Israel's military is optimized for regional conflicts, not for great power naval warfare. If the threat to Israeli security comes not just from Iranian proxies on its borders, but from Iranian missiles and drones launched from the Persian Gulf, supported by Chinese satellite targeting and Chinese cyber disruption, the calculus changes. Israel has invested heavily in long-range strike capabilities, from ballistic missiles to submarine-launched cruise missiles, precisely to address this contingency. But a strike against Iranian military infrastructure is far more complex if that infrastructure is protected by Chinese-supplied air defenses, Chinese early warning systems, and the implicit deterrent of Chinese great power interest. The scenario in which Israel faces a multi-front missile saturation scenario becomes far more dangerous if the saturation includes weapons that are more accurate, more numerous, and more difficult to intercept because of foreign technological support. What analysts fear most is not a single decisive battle, but a gradual erosion of American naval credibility. The U.S. Navy has never lost a major fleet engagement since World War II. Its reputation for invincibility is a strategic asset in itself, deterring potential adversaries simply by existing. But reputations can be eroded without being destroyed. A series of incidents in which American ships are damaged by Iranian drones, in which carrier operations are disrupted by missile threats, in which submarine patrols are forced to withdraw because of unacceptable risk, could chip away at that reputation without ever producing a formal defeat. Over time, allies might begin to doubt American guarantees. Adversaries might begin to test American resolve more aggressively. And the global order that has depended on American naval supremacy for 7 decades might begin to fracture at the seams. This is why the question of Chinese support for Iran's military is not merely a bilateral issue. It is a systemic issue, a challenge to the architecture of global security that has been built around American power projection. China does not need to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship to challenge that architecture. It merely needs to raise the cost of maintaining it to a point where the United States must choose between competing priorities, between the Pacific and the Gulf, between deterring China and containing Iran. And if that choice becomes too painful, if the American public and political leadership conclude that the burden is no longer sustainable, then the withdrawal may not be dramatic. It may be gradual, unacknowledged, and irreversible. A carrier strike group that does not return, a base that is not reinforced, a commitment that is not renewed. The end of an era may look less like a battle and more like a budget line item. The technological race adds urgency to this analysis. China is investing heavily in hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and autonomous systems, all of which have naval applications. Iran may not receive the most advanced Chinese systems directly, but it may benefit from the diffusion of technology that occurs when Chinese firms operate in Iranian markets, when Chinese and Iranian engineers collaborate on projects, and when Chinese academic research is published and studied by Iranian scientists. The gap between what China deploys and what Iran can acquire is not static. It narrows over time as technologies mature, as manufacturing processes are refined, and as the global defense market adapts to evade sanctions and export controls. A weapon that is too sensitive to transfer today may be routine in 5 years. A capability that seems exotic now may be standard in a decade. The 25-year framework that governs China-Iran relations provides a timeline for this diffusion that aligns disturbingly with the pace of technological change. For American naval commanders operating in the Gulf today, the immediate challenge is tactical. They must plan for a threat environment that includes ballistic missiles with maneuvering warheads, drone swarms with autonomous targeting, submarines with advanced quieting, and cyber attacks on shipboard systems. They must do this while maintaining the visibility and presence that deterrence requires. knowing that every patrol is an opportunity for Iranian forces to observe, learn, and potentially test. They must coordinate with allies whose capabilities vary widely and whose political constraints may limit their willingness to engage. And they must accomplish all of this with a fleet that is aging in some classes, undermanned in some ratings, and overstretched by global commitments. It is a demanding operational environment, and it is getting harder, not easier. The strategic response, if there is to be one, must address both the Iranian threat and the Chinese source. Sanctions on Iranian military procurement have slowed but not stopped the flow of technology. Strengthening those sanctions and enforcing them more aggressively against Chinese entities that violate them is one approach. But sanctions are a blunt instrument, and China's economy is large enough to absorb considerable pain without changing its strategic calculus. Another approach is to accelerate American military modernization to field the next generation of missile defenses, unmanned systems, and distributed maritime operations before the threat can mature. But modernization requires money, time, and political will, all of which are in short supply. A third approach is to seek diplomatic understandings with China that establish red lines for military support to Iran, but the track record of such understandings in great power competition is not encouraging. When core interests are at stake, agreements tend to be observed only as long as they are convenient. What is clear is that the status quo is not sustainable. A U.S. Navy that assumes Persian Gulf dominance as a birthright, that plans its operations around the expectation of uncontested sea control, is a Navy that is preparing for the last war rather than the next one. The transformation of Iran's military capabilities, supported by Chinese technology and Chinese strategic interest, is a trend line that points toward a more contested, more dangerous, more unpredictable maritime environment. It does not mean that American naval power is finished in the Middle East. It does mean that the terms of that power are changing, and that the margin of superiority that once seemed infinite is now finite and shrinking. If this scenario unfolds, the first 72 hours of any future Gulf crisis may look very different from what American planners have traditionally assumed. Instead of uncontested air and sea dominance, there may be contested access. Instead of clear escalation dominance, there may be mutual vulnerability. Instead of a swift campaign to restore order, there may be a protracted struggle to manage risk in an environment where every American ship is a high-value target and every Iranian platform is a potential threat. The U.S. Navy has faced difficult environments before, from the Pacific Island campaigns of World War II to the minefields of the Persian Gulf in the 1980s. It has prevailed through superior technology, superior training, and superior will. But it has rarely prevailed by underestimating the enemy, and the enemy that is emerging in the Gulf today is more capable, more connected, and more dangerous than at any point in the past 4 decades. This may be less about what has happened and more about what could happen next. The Chinese support for Iran's military is not a secret revealed by leaked intelligence. It is a pattern visible in open sources, in procurement records, in defense exhibitions, and in the operational characteristics of Iranian weapons. It is a relationship that is developed over years, that is embedded in broader economic and political frameworks, and that is likely to continue regardless of American objections. The question is not whether China will stop supporting Iran's military. The question is whether the United States can adapt its naval strategy, its force structure, and its regional posture to account for a threat that is no longer purely Iranian, but is increasingly a hybrid of Iranian ambition and Chinese capability. Tonight, as American sailors stand watch in the Persian Gulf, they are guarding waters that have become more dangerous than their maps suggest. The missiles on the Iranian coast may be more accurate than intelligence estimated. The drones in the air may be more numerous than exercises predicted. The submarines in the depths may be quieter than sonar expected. And the hand that helped build these capabilities may be thousands of miles away, in Beijing, calculating that every additional risk imposed on the U.S. Navy is a step toward a world in which American power is no longer the defining feature of the global maritime order. What matters now is whether Washington recognizes the scale of this challenge and acts before the margin of safety disappears entirely.